The Vikings, the most feared warriors in medieval Europe, came from the most marginal land in medieval Europe. A coastline too cold to farm, a growing season too short to feed a population, a geography so remote the rest of the world had largely forgotten it existed. And yet, from that frozen edge of the known world came the men who terrorized every coastline from Ireland to Constantinople, who settled Iceland and Greenland, who reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus, and who, now for nearly 300 years, made the entire Christian world afraid of the sea. How does the harshest corner of Europe produce the most consequential seafarers of the medieval age? So that is not a simple question. And anyone who answers it in one sentence is not answering it at all. Before the history can begin, the word has to be taken apart. Because the word is doing enormous damage. It is carrying assumptions about identity, about ethnicity, just about a fixed and coherent people with a shared culture and a shared destiny. Assumptions that the historical record does not support, and that archaeology has spent decades quietly dismantling. The Vikings were not a race. They were not a tribe. They were not even in any meaningful sense a nation. The word that names them was never meant to name a people at all. In Old Norse, there were 2 related words. Vikingur referred to a person. Viking referred to an activity, a voyage, and specifically a raiding voyage undertaken during the sailing season. The relationship between the two was straightforward. A Vikingur was a man who went on a Viking. He was defined by what he did, not by where he was born or who his father was. A farmer who spent 3 summers raiding the English coast and then came home to his fields was a Vikingur during those summers. When he put down his weapons and picked up a plow, the word no longer applied. Now, where the word itself came from is genuinely contested. The most widely repeated explanation traces it to the Old Norse vik, meaning a bay or inlet. A Vikingur being, roughly, a man of the bays, someone who lurked in coastal inlets waiting to strike passing ships. A second theory connects it to the Old Norse vika, a sea mile, a unit of distance measured by a shift of rowers, which would make the word fundamentally nautical, built out of the mechanics of the oar bench rather than the shape of the coastline. A third possibility links it to an older route meaning to travel or to turn aside, capturing the essential quality of a man perpetually in motion, never quite settled. None of these explanations is proven. All of them are consistent with how the word was used. What is clear from the runestones and skaldic poetry that survive from the actual Viking Age is that the word carried no ethnic weight. It was closer to a job description than a nationality. The people of Scandinavia did not call themselves Vikings. They identified themselves by family, by clan, by the region they came from. A man from the western fjords of Norway was a Norseman. A man from Jutland was a Dane. A man from the eastern coast of Sweden was a Sver. These were the identities that mattered, specific, local, tied to land and lineage. The broad category that modern people call Viking was invisible to the people inside it. The word vanished almost entirely from active use after the Viking Age ended. It resurfaced, transformed in the early 19th century, and the transformation was total. In 1811, a Swedish poet and historian named Erik Gustaf Geyer published a poem called Vikingen as part of a nationalistic literary movement whose explicit purpose was to construct a Swedish national identity rooted in a heroic Norse past. Geyer's Viking was not a seasonal raider going out to earn silver. He was a noble warrior type, a man of the sea, the embodiment of a national spirit that Sweden, bruised by recent military defeats and political humiliation, badly needed to believe it possessed. That poem did not describe the past. It invented a version of it. The Viking identity that fills the films, the television series, the merchandise, and the popular histories of today is substantially a 19th century creation built by romantic nationalists who needed ancestral heroes and found them heavily edited in the Norse past. the horned helmets that never existed, the idea of a unified Viking people with a single culture and a shared destiny, the warrior race mythology. Yet all of it crystallized in that period, was amplified by later writers and eventually by Hollywood, and arrived in the 21st century carrying the authority of ancient fact. The actual people of the Norse world were considerably more complicated, considerably more diverse, and considerably more interesting than the legend their descendants built around them. To understand what produced the Viking Age, you first have to stand in the land that produced it and see it plainly, as without the softening effect of scenery. Scandinavia is, by almost every agricultural measure, one of the least hospitable regions in Europe. The Scandinavian peninsula runs roughly 1,900 kilometers from north to south, covering an area larger than the Iberian Peninsula. The vast majority of it is granite bedrock, glacially scoured mountain, dense boreal forest, and standing water. The soils that remain after the last ice age's retreat are thin, acidic, and slow to recover. Yet Norway alone has less than 3% of its total land area classified as arable. Sweden and Denmark together bring the regional average up, but only Denmark, flat, southern, sheltered Denmark, has farmland that looks anything like the productive agricultural zones of England or France. The mountain spine that runs down the western edge of the peninsula is not a gentle ridge. It is a hard wall, the Scandinavian mountains known in Norse as the Kjollen. Now the Kiel, rising in places above 2,400 meters and pushing all viable agricultural land into narrow coastal strips and river valleys on either side. On the Norwegian coast, those strips are sometimes only a few hundred meters wide before the land drops into a fjord or rises again into rock. The fjords themselves, of which there are more than 1,000 along the Norwegian coastline alone, are dramatic and beautiful and almost entirely useless for farming. They are, however, done superb for something else entirely, and that contradiction sits at the heart of everything that follows. The forest covered most of what was not mountain and not fjord. Norway was roughly 2/3 forested in the early medieval period. Sweden was higher still. These were not managed woodlands in any modern sense. They were old-growth boreal forests, spruce, pine, birch, dense enough to block the light, and slow enough to recover from clearing that a farm family might exhaust the fertility of a newly cut plot within a single generation and need to move. A farming community in pre-Viking Scandinavia was not fixed to its ground the way a French or English village was. A family cleared a patch of forest, worked it for a generation, and watched the yields fall until it was no longer worth the effort. Then they moved, cleared again, and started over. The land did not hold people. It cycled through them. Yet the growing season was the binding constraint. In southern Scandinavia, Denmark, Skåne, the Swedish lowlands, farmers could expect perhaps 5 months between the last frost and the first. In central Norway, that window narrowed to 4, further north, to 3 or less. The crops that could survive these conditions were few: barley, rye, and oats, all of them hardy, all of them low yield by the standards of more temperate agriculture. Yet wheat could be grown in the most sheltered southern areas as something close to a luxury crop, but it was never a staple. What this meant in practice was that a Norse farm family lived very close to the margin. A wet summer, a late frost, an early snow. Any single failure could consume the reserves built up over previous years and push a household toward starvation before spring. Livestock filled the gap that crops could not reliably close. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses were the actual foundation of Norse subsistence, more dependable than grain and more central to the diet. Dairy products, butter, cheese, whey, buttermilk, were valued on a par with meat. But livestock required something the short growing season made extremely difficult to produce in sufficient quantity: hay. Every cow and sheep that was to survive the winter had to be fed on stored fodder cut from summer meadows. This meant that the productive work of a Norse summer was not primarily about growing food for the family. It was about growing food for the animals. The cattle came indoors around October and did not go out again until April. A farm that ran short of hay in February did not lose a harvest. It lost its herd, and with it, everything. Against this picture of constrained, marginal, frost-threatened agriculture, the coastline looks like something else entirely. Norway's coastline, including its islands, runs to approximately 59,000 kilometers, the second longest of any nation on Earth. The fjord system created thousands of sheltered anchorages, deep enough for large vessels, calm enough for small ones. The sea did not freeze over along the western coast, kept open by the warm waters of the Gulf Stream. Fish, cod, herring, salmon, were available in quantities that no amount of agricultural effort could match. Marine mammals offered fat and hide. And the sea was not a barrier to this world. It was a highway, and it had been one for thousands of years before a single longship was built. You have to hold both pictures at once, the thin soil and the short summer on one side, and the extraordinary coastline on the other. A Norse farming family in the 8th century lived its life between these two realities. The land fed them barely enough. The sea offered everything beyond bare survival: trade, fish, timber transport, to connection to other communities, and, eventually, something much more consequential. The geography did not produce the Viking Age by accident. It made certain kinds of activity almost inevitable and others nearly impossible. And the combination of those pressures, accumulating over centuries, pointed a very specific kind of society in a very specific direction. Denmark was different, and the difference matters. Flat, low-lying, geologically distinct from the Granite Peninsula to its north, Denmark had real agricultural soil. The accumulated deposits of glacial moraines worked over centuries into productive farmland. By the standards of the Viking world, Denmark was rich in grain. It was also the closest part of Scandinavia to the rest of Europe, sharing a land border with the Frankish world, positioned at the entrance to the Baltic. The Danes felt the pressures of the wider European world more directly and more immediately than anyone further north. Their geography made them traders and farmers as much as seafarers, and their proximity to Christian Europe made them, when the moment came, the first to move. There is an image that attaches itself, almost automatically, to the word Viking: tall, fair-haired, pale-eyed, built for cold and violence, a distinct physical type that the popular imagination treats as self-evident. It is an image built from centuries of assumption, amplified by nationalist mythology, and hardened by film and television into something close to visual fact. Ancient DNA has not simply complicated that image, it has dissolved it. The people of the Viking Age were not a genetically distinct population. They were not a race. They were not, by any meaningful genetic measure, a coherent group. What the bones and teeth of the actual dead reveal is something far more interesting. A population assembled across thousands of years from migrations that would have astonished anyone who believed the Norse to be a people apart. The story begins not with the Viking Age, but with the ending of the Ice Age. When the great ice sheets retreated from northern Europe around 11,000 years ago, the land they uncovered was colonized almost immediately by hunter-gatherers moving in from the south and east. These were the Western hunter-gatherers, dark-skinned, dark-eyed, genetically distinct from any modern European population. In Scandinavia, their descendants persisted for thousands of years, longer than almost anywhere else in Europe, hunting elk, fishing coastal shallows, and leaving their traces in shell middens along the Norwegian and Swedish coasts. They were the first people of Scandinavia, and their genetic signature still runs through modern Scandinavians today, diluted but present. Around 5,900 years ago, Farmers from Anatolia reached southern Scandinavia. They were shorter than the hunter-gatherers, darker-haired, adapted to a settled agricultural life. They brought domestic cattle, sheep, wheat, and barley. Across most of Europe, their arrival was followed by the near-complete displacement of the hunter-gatherer populations. In Scandinavia, the process was slower. The hunter-gatherers persisted alongside the farmers for centuries in some areas, and the genetic mixing between the two groups left a signal that remains detectable today. From its earliest period of human occupation, Scandinavia was a place where different people met and mixed. The third and most transformative wave came from the east. Around 5,000 years ago, herders from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea, and across what is now Ukraine and Russia, began moving into Europe in enormous numbers. They brought horses, wheeled vehicles, and almost certainly the Proto-Indo-European language that eventually became the ancestor of almost every tongue spoken in Europe today. Within a few centuries of this expansion reaching northern Europe, steppe ancestry accounted for the majority of the genetic profile across Scandinavia. The language the Norse spoke in the Viking Age, Old Norse, descended directly from the language those steppe herders carried west 3,000 years before the first raid on an English shore. These three streams, hunter-gatherer, Anatolian farmer, and Pontic steppe herder, were the deep genetic foundation of the Viking Age population. But they were not the whole story even before the Viking Age began. From the Roman Iron Age onward, people moved into Scandinavia from southern Europe, from the eastern Baltic, from the British Isles, through trade, through war, through capture, through marriage. By the time the first longships launched, the population of Scandinavia was already the accumulated product of thousands of years of movement and contact with the wider world. A man could grow up in Ireland, learn to fight, sail north, and spend his life raiding under a Norse chieftain whose grandfather had never left Scandinavia. If he proved himself, he was one of them. He wore the same weapons, observed the same rituals, was buried in the same manner. The Norse world did not require a particular bloodline. It required participation. In the raid, in the ship, in the hall, in the obligations the ship, in the hall, in the obligations of loyalty and violence that held those things together. Across the Viking Age, Scots, Irish, Slavs, Sami, and Balts all moved into this world and were absorbed by it, some willingly, some not, leaving their children behind in communities that called themselves Norse without qualification. The men and women who sacked Lindisfarne and settled Iceland were not, as a group, the pale, fair-haired physical type that 9 centuries of portraiture and 2 centuries of cinema have established as self-evidently Norse. A significant portion of them were dark-haired. A significant portion carried the physical inheritance of people who had lived for thousands of years across a range stretching from the British Isles to the eastern Baltic. The tall, blond, blue-eyed Norseman was real. He existed, he raided, he sailed, but he shared his deck with men and women who looked nothing like him, and nobody on that deck considered this remarkable. Women moved through this world too, and not only as captives. And Irish and Scottish women settled in Greenland and Iceland alongside Norse men, raised children in turf longhouses at the edge of the known world, and were buried with the full material dignity of the Norse household. Their children grew up speaking Old Norse, worshipping Norse gods, and thinking of themselves as Norse in every way that mattered. Within a generation, the Irish grandmother was invisible. What remained was a family, a farm, and a name that would appear in the Icelandic sagas as thoroughly Norse as any other. The Sami lived in the mountains and forests of northern Scandinavia, herding reindeer across landscapes that Norse farmers could not use and did not want. The two worlds were never truly separate. Norse chieftains collected tribute from Sami communities, furs, hides, dried meat, and Sami shamans were sought out by Norse men and women for knowledge that the Norse religious tradition acknowledged it did not possess. Children were born between the two peoples. Some were raised Norse, some were raised Sami. Some moved between both worlds across the course of a single life. The boundary that popular history draws between them was, on the ground, a great deal more porous than anyone comfortable with the idea of a pure Norse people would prefer to admit. So around 500 BCE, something changed in Scandinavia that would take 1,000 years to fully work out its consequences. Bronze, the metal that had built the prestige economy of Northern Europe for nearly a millennium, became scarce. The trade routes that had carried tin up from the Atlantic coast and copper in from Central Europe collapsed under the pressure of wars and disruptions further south. And the great network of exchange that had kept Scandinavian elites stocked with gleaming bronze weapons and ornaments quietly fell apart. What replaced it was iron, and the replacement was not a smooth transition. Iron was harder to make, required higher temperatures, produced a more brittle product until the techniques were mastered, and carried none of the aesthetic prestige of bronze. For several generations, Scandinavian metalworkers made an inferior product by the standards of what had come before. Then they got better, and when they did, everything changed. Iron was not imported. It came from the ground beneath their feet, from the bog ore that precipitated in the peat of Scandinavian wetlands, clumps of brown iron oxide that could be dug from the earth, smelted in simple clay furnaces, and hammered into tools and weapons without any dependence on long-distance trade. Every community that sat beside a bog had access to the raw material for its own iron. A farmer who knew how to work a bloomery furnace could produce the iron for his own plow blade and his own spear without traveling further than the nearest marsh. This self-sufficiency was new. It was also transformative. When iron reached every farm, and not just every chieftain's hall, the social structure that had been built on the controlled distribution of prestigious bronze began, slowly and irreversibly, to shift. The world that iron built in Scandinavia was more agricultural and more violent simultaneously. Iron plowshares could break heavier soils than bronze or wooden tools had managed, pushing cultivation into ground that had been marginal before. Settlements became larger and more permanent. Fields were demarcated and held across generations rather than abandoned when the soil tired. At the same time, the iron weapons were cheap enough to arm not just warrior elites, but ordinary free men, and the communities that formed around the better land were communities that needed to defend it. The longhouse, a single long timber structure housing an extended family and their livestock under one roof, became the standard unit of settlement across Scandinavia, clusters of them forming the small villages that would persist, with variations, through the Viking Age and beyond. By the 1st century CE, if the Roman Empire had pushed its frontier to the Rhine, and the world north of that river entered Roman awareness as a place of dense forest, perpetual cold, and tall, fierce people who had defeated 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE and never let Rome forget it. Roman writers described the Germanic peoples, among whom the Scandinavians were included, loosely under the same broad label, as dangerous, unpredictable, and possessed of a warrior culture that Rome found both threatening and, in a particular way, admirable. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in 98 CE, produced a detailed account of Germanic society that remains, for all its biases and romanticizations, the most substantive external description of the world that would eventually produce the Vikings. What Tacitus described was a society organized around the warrior retinue. A chieftain of any significance maintained a group of young fighters, the comitatus, who lived in his hall, ate at his table, and were bound to him by personal loyalty rather than by law or territory. The chieftain gave gifts. The warriors gave their swords. A man who survived his lord in battle was dishonored for life, because the bond was not merely political, but something close to sacred. The retinue fought together, feasted together, and were expected to die together if the situation demanded it. This was not a tribal army of farmers called up in an emergency. It was a professional fighting force maintained year-round, fed by the surplus of a household economy, and oriented entirely toward violence as the primary source of both wealth and status. Roman silver flowed north in enormous quantities across the first 3 centuries. Through trade, through tribute, and through the pay of Germanic mercenaries serving in Roman auxiliary units. A Scandinavian warrior who spent time on the Rhine frontier came home with Roman coins, Roman equipment, and Roman tactical knowledge. The silver that accumulated in Scandinavian chieftains' hoards did not stay there as mere wealth. It was redistributed, given as rings, as armbands, as silver-mounted sword hilts, to the members of the retinue, functioning as the visible token of the bond between lord and man. A chieftain who stopped giving silver stopped being a chieftain. The gift economy ran on Roman metal, and the Roman metal ran on the labor of Germanic warriors, and the whole system turned in a circle that kept the warrior at its center. The boats were already old by the time Rome encountered Scandinavia. Around 350 BCE, on the island of Als off the southern coast of Denmark, a raiding party arrived from the sea. 80 to 100 warriors in 4 or 5 vessels, armed with iron spears, swords, and shields. The defenders repelled them. What happened next reveals something essential about the religious world that surrounded warfare in this period. The victors took the captured weapons, the swords, the spears, the shields, a boat, broke and bent and destroyed them deliberately and sank them into a bog as an offering of thanks to whatever power had granted them victory. They did not keep the weapons. They gave them back to the earth and the water. The act was not peculiar. It was expected. Across Scandinavia, the proper response to military victory was not to display the spoils, but to destroy them, consecrating the wealth of the defeated enemy to forces greater than any individual warrior. The boat from that raid on Als survived in the peat for 2,000 years. It was over 19 meters long, built from overlapping limewood planks sewn together with bast fiber cord and sealed with a mixture of animal fat and pine tar. It had no sail. It was paddled by perhaps 20 men, sitting on thwarts, driving the narrow hull through the water at speeds that surprised anyone who tried to replicate the design. The construction was sophisticated, the planks shaped and fitted with a precision that took years to learn. And it was old even in 350 BCE. The tradition of building plank boats in this manner stretched back into the Bronze Age, visible in the rock carvings of hundreds of vessels scratched into the granite outcrops of coastal Scandinavia. The boat was not new technology when the raiders came to Als. It was an inheritance. The bog offerings grew larger across the Roman Iron Age. At Illerup Odal in central Jutland, over several events between roughly 200 and 500 CE, whole armies' worth of weapons were destroyed and given to the water. The equipment of hundreds of warriors organized by rank, the ordinary soldiers marked by iron shield bosses, the officers by bronze, the commanders by silver. The sheer scale of these deposits tells something about the society that made them. This was a world that could raise armies numbering in the hundreds, equip them uniformly, march them to war, and, upon winning, destroy more wealth in a single ritual act than most communities could accumulate in a generation. A society capable of that was not marginal. It was organized, surplus-producing, and governed by a religious framework in which the relationship between violence and the sacred was not incidental, but foundational. The Roman connection produced something else too, something that would matter later. A class of Scandinavian men who had seen the wider world. A young Norseman who served as an auxiliary on the Danube frontier for 5 years had seen cities, roads, organized logistics, agricultural surpluses on a scale impossible at home, Ostian, the systematic extraction of wealth from subject populations by a military elite. He came home. He brought the knowledge with him. He was not going to spend the rest of his life watching his barley fail in a wet summer. The Roman Empire spent 3 centuries educating its northern neighbors in what wealth looked like and how it could be taken, and it never fully understood what it was doing. By the late Roman period, Scandinavian society had hardened into a recognizable shape. That there were free farmers, the backbone of every community, the men who worked the land and owed military service to whoever held power in their district. There were thralls, slaves, taken in raids, inherited, purchased, who performed the heaviest labor and whose presence at the bottom of the hierarchy made the freedom of the farmer meaningful by contrast. And above the farmers, there were the chieftains and their retinues, men whose entire identity was organized around warfare and the gift-giving that warfare funded. The 3 layers were not rigid. A man could move between them, upward through martial success, downward through debt or defeat. But the structure was clear, and it had been forming for centuries, and it was almost complete. What it needed was a trigger. In the winter of 376 CE, something extraordinary happened on the northern bank of the Danube. Tens of thousands of Goths, men, women, children, livestock, wagons, appeared at the river's edge and asked to be let in. Not to raid, not to trade, to stay. The Eastern Roman Emperor Valens allowed it, reluctantly, because the Goths were not asking. They were fleeing. Behind them, moving west across the steppe at a speed no settled people could quite believe, came the Huns, riders from somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, expert archers on horseback, in a military force that the Gothic chieftains had concluded could not be defeated in open battle. The Goths crossed the Danube into Roman territory and brought with them the first tremors of a catastrophe that would, within a century, dissolve the Western Roman Empire and remake every political structure in Europe, including the world that would eventually produce the Vikings. The Huns had come from the steppes east of the Caspian Sea, almost certainly from the region of modern Kazakhstan. They were nomadic pastoralists, people who had built their entire civilization around the horse, the composite bow, and the ability to strike and vanish across distances that sedentary armies could not follow. They arrived in Europe in the 370s without warning, without diplomatic preamble, and without any apparent interest in the political arrangements they were disrupting. The Alans fell first, then the Ostrogoths. Then the Visigoths broke for the Danube. The Huns did not pursue them across the river. They did not need to. The pressure of their presence alone had set the entire barbarian world west of the Volga into motion, and that motion would not stop for nearly 2 centuries. The domino effect moved fast. The Visigoths, once inside Roman territory, were mistreated by corrupt Roman officials, rose in rebellion, and in 378 CE destroyed a Roman army at Adrianople, killing the Emperor Valens himself. It was the worst Roman military defeat in over 4 centuries, and a signal to every people on the Roman frontier that the empire's invincibility was a myth that had expired. In 406 CE, a coalition of Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the frozen Rhine into Gaul. Rome had never seen its Rhine frontier broken in this way. The breach was permanent. Within a generation, Vandals were in North Africa, Visigoths were in Spain, Angles and Saxons were crossing the North Sea to Britain. The map of the Western world was being redrawn faster than anyone could keep track of, and it was not being redrawn by Roman hands. Scandinavia was not at the center of these events. The Huns never reached the Scandinavian peninsula. Roman legions never marched north of the Elbe in numbers that threatened Norse communities. But Scandinavia was not untouched. Germanic peoples with close cultural and probably kinship ties to the Norse had been moving south and west for generations, and the migration period accelerated that movement dramatically. The Angles left the Danish mainland for Britain in the 5th century. The heralds, a people with documented Scandinavian connections, ranged across the Roman world as mercenaries and raiders, some of them returning north after the collapse of Hunnic power, with knowledge, silver, and habits of violence acquired in the service of dying empires. Scandinavia sent people into the storm. Some came back. What arrived back in Scandinavia along with the returning warriors was gold, more gold than the North had ever seen. The Western Roman Empire spent its final decades buying off the barbarian groups pressing against it, transferring enormous quantities of precious metal in tribute, in mercenary pay, and in diplomatic gifts to chieftains who might, for a year or two, agree to be problems elsewhere. Scandinavian warriors who served in these conflicts as members of Gothic war bands, whereas Roman auxiliaries as independent raiders picking at the carcass of a collapsing frontier, came home carrying Roman coin, looted plate, and gold ornaments of a quality and quantity that dwarfed anything previously circulating in the Norse world. The hoards that appear in Scandinavian soil from the 5th century onward are the physical record of that transfer. Breastplates stamped with images borrowed from Roman imperial coinage, arm rings of solid gold, and sword fittings that would not have looked out of place in a late Roman general's tent. The gold did not distribute itself evenly. It concentrated. The chieftains who controlled the networks through which warriors were recruited, equipped, and deployed were the ones who captured the largest share of the incoming wealth. A man who could put 50 trained fighters on a ship and sell their services to a Gothic king or a desperate Roman governor could return with enough silver to make himself the most powerful person in his district by a margin that no amount of good harvests could close. The gap between the successful chieftain class and the ordinary free farmer widened rapidly across the 5th century, producing social stratification steeper than anything the Germanic Iron Age had known. And the Norse world was sorting itself into a small number of very wealthy, heavily armed households, and a much larger population of people dependent on those households for protection, justice, and access to the trade networks that the elite controlled. The crisis also emptied land. Across Denmark and southern Sweden, large areas that had been settled and farmed through the Roman Iron Age were abandoned during the migration period. The causes were tangled. Plague, probably. And moving along the same trade routes that carried silver and news of the Hunnic advance. Crop failures linked to climatic deterioration. The departure of young men for the continental wars, some of whom never returned. And the predatory consolidation of the surviving elite, who absorbed the farms of the weak and the dead into their own growing estates. Villages that had stood for generations were left to the weeds. The forests began to reclaim cleared land. A traveler moving through southern Scandinavia in 480 CE would have passed farmsteads standing empty, their longhouses still intact, but their fires cold, the field boundaries visible but unworked. The consolidation of power into fewer hands had a direct military consequence. The petty chieftains who had commanded small, local retinues in the Germanic Iron Age were replaced, across the migration period, by something larger and more dangerous, regional strongmen who could field hundreds of warriors rather than dozens, who controlled enough agricultural surplus to feed those warriors year-round, and who had the political reach to forge alliances with other powerful households across distances of hundreds of kilometers. The Norse world was building, slowly and violently, the kind of political units that could organize large-scale seaborne expeditions rather than local cattle raids. The military capacity that would one day terrorize Lindisfarne was being assembled across these 2 brutal centuries of consolidation, although the men doing the assembling had no such destination in mind. The Hunnic Empire itself was short-lived. Attila, who had built it to its greatest extent by the 400s and 40s, died in 453 CE, and the political structure he had held together by personal force dissolved within a decade. The Germanic peoples his empire had dominated, Goths, Gepids, Erugians turned on his sons and broke the Hunnic Confederation at the Battle of Nidau in 454 CE. The immediate pressure that had set the migration period in motion was gone. But what it had set in motion could not be recalled. The Western Roman Empire stumbled on until 476 CE, when its last emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, who saw no reason to maintain a fiction that had stopped serving any practical purpose. The greatest political structure the Western world had ever built was over. The space it left behind was not empty. It was full of armed, ambitious men who had spent 2 centuries learning how to take things by force. For Scandinavia, the end of the migration period was the beginning of something. The crisis had killed the weak, concentrated wealth in the hands of the strong, emptied marginal land, built larger and more capable military units, and filled the north with men who had seen the wider world and found it available. The trade networks that had carried Roman silver north now carried other things. Information about coastal monasteries, about undefended river towns, about the enormous accumulated wealth of Christian Europe sitting behind walls built for a different kind of threat. The Vendel Age that followed was not a recovery. It was a preparation. By the middle of the 6th century, the worst of the migration period had passed. The Hunnic Empire was gone. The great movements of peoples across the Roman world had settled, more or less, into new arrangements. Visigoths in Spain, Franks in Gaul, Lombards in Italy, Angles and Saxons in Britain. Scandinavia had sent people into all of it and absorbed some of what came back. What followed, across the next 2.5 centuries, was a period that popular history has almost completely ignored. And that is a serious mistake, because everything that made the Viking Age possible was built in these years. The ships were built here. The warrior ideology was built here. The political structures were built here. The Norse gods, in the form the Viking Age would actually use them, took their final shape here. By the time the first longship beached on an English shore in 793, the civilization it carried was not new. It was complete. The Vendel Age takes its name from a cluster of farms in Uppland in eastern Sweden, into where the wealthiest members of the Norse warrior aristocracy buried their dead with a thoroughness that makes the breath catch. A chieftain was laid in a boat, a real boat large enough to sail, surrounded by his weapons, his helmet, his shield, his horses, his dogs, his gaming pieces, his imported glassware from the Frankish world, and, in some cases, the bodies of servants who would accompany him wherever the dead went. The boat was then covered with earth and left to rise as a mound on the landscape, a permanent marker of power that every person in the district could see from a distance. Death, in this world, was not a private matter. It was a political statement. The helmets from these graves were extraordinary objects. An iron dome fitted with cheek guards and a mail curtain protecting the neck, covered in pressed bronze panels depicting warriors in battle, Odin figures, and interlaced animals whose meaning was almost certainly religious. To wear one of these helmets was not simply to protect your head. It was to wear your cosmology on your face, to go into battle armored in myth, in the authority of the gods, in the visual language of a warrior culture that had been elaborating itself for centuries. The helmets from Vendel and from the contemporary Anglo-Saxon grave at Sutton Hoo in England were so similar in construction and decoration that the men who made them were almost certainly working within the same artistic tradition, probably connected by trade and by the movement of skilled craftsmen across the North Sea. The Sutton Hoo matters here because it is a window into something the Vendel Age had built that no subsequent development would dismantle, a network of aristocratic culture spanning the North Sea. The Anglo-Saxon king buried at Sutton Hoo around 625 CE was not a Viking. He was English, the ruler of East Anglia, a kingdom descended from Angles who had crossed from Denmark a century and a half earlier. but the objects in his grave connected him directly to the Swedish warrior aristocracy, where the helmet was Vendel. The shield designs were Vendel. The ship burial itself was Vendel. The North Sea in the 7th century was not a barrier between worlds. It was a highway shared by an aristocratic culture that expressed itself in the same visual language from Upland to East Anglia. The ships that crossed that highway were getting better throughout the Vendel Age in ways that would eventually change the world. Where the Nidam ship of the 4th century had been a capable rowing vessel, 23 meters long, clinker-built, fast on flat water, but it had no sail and no true keel. It was a raiding vessel for coastal work, dependent entirely on the strength of its oarsmen. By the late Vendel period, that was changing. Around 780 CE on the Norwegian coast at Kvalsund, shipwrights completed a vessel 18 meters long with a hull shape that represented a decisive advance over anything built before it. The Kvalsund ship had a pronounced structural keel, the backbone that would allow a mast to be stepped and a sail to be carried without tearing the hull apart. It was broken and given to a bog as an offering almost immediately after its construction, which means someone built the best ship of their generation and then destroyed it as a gift to the gods. The act says something about the society that could afford to make it. The sail was the technology that made the Viking Age possible. It arrived in Scandinavian shipbuilding across the 7th and 8th centuries, almost certainly adopted from contact with Frankish and Frisian merchants who had been sailing with square rigs for generations. Before the sail, a longship's range was limited by the endurance of its crew. 100 men could row a vessel perhaps 60 to 80 kilometers in a day before exhaustion set in. With a sail on a following wind, that same vessel could cover 200 kilometers with the crew resting. The operational radius of a Norse warship did not expand incrementally when the sail arrived. It exploded. The islands of the North Atlantic, Orkney, Shetland, the Faroes, eventually Iceland, moved from the edge of the imaginable to the edge of the reachable in the space of a generation. The Vendel warrior was a specific kind of human being, shaped by a specific set of institutions. He had grown up in a chieftain's hall, sleeping with the other young men of the retinue, eating at the Lord's table, drilling with weapons in the yard. He had probably seen his first real violence before he was 15. He was embedded in a gift economy in which every weapon he carried, every piece of silver at his throat, every horse he rode had come from the hand of his lord, and the reciprocal obligation that created to fight, to follow, is to die if necessary, was not experienced as a constraint but as the structure of meaning itself. A man outside the retinue had no social existence worth naming. He was nobody. The hall was everything, and the lord of the hall was the axis around which every meaningful thing in a young warrior's life turned. The religious world that surrounded this warrior was not yet fully the Norse mythology that the later sagas would record, but it was close. Odin was already the god of warriors, of death, yes, of the desperate gamble and the costly victory. The idea that dying in battle was a form of selection, that Odin's choosers gathered the best of the fallen and brought them to his hall, was already operating as a functional theology, shaping the behavior of men who took it seriously. A Vendel warrior who broke and ran in battle was not merely a coward. He had failed a divine test. He had demonstrated before gods and men that he was not among the chosen. The shame of that was that within the value system of the hall, worse than death, which meant that death in battle was, in a very practical sense, preferable to survival through cowardice. The political landscape of Vendel period Scandinavia was a patchwork of petty kingdoms, each centered on a great hall and its lord, each existing in a state of permanent competitive tension with its neighbors. There was no king of Scandinavia. There was barely a king of Norway in any meaningful sense. Power was local, personal, and continuously contested. A chieftain held his position because he could defend it, because his retinue was loyal, because his silver kept flowing, because he had not yet lost a battle that cost him everything. The internal competition for status and land was intense. And it had a consequence that would eventually become the Viking Age's most important structural feature. It produced a constant supply of young men who had lost the competition for position at home and needed to find another way to acquire the wealth and standing that the hall demanded. From the south, a new pressure was building. The Franks under the Merovingian dynasty, and then under the early Carolingians, had been expanding their power steadily across the 7th and 8th centuries, absorbing neighboring peoples and incorporating them into a Christian political order. For most of Scandinavia, this was distant noise, geographically remote and politically irrelevant. For the Danes, it was neither. Denmark shared a land border with the Saxon territories that the Franks were pushing against, and the Saxons were kin, culturally, linguistically, and religiously close to the Norse world. When the Franks began their sustained military campaign against Saxon paganism in the 700s and 70s, yet the Norse aristocracy was watching. What they saw was the most powerful Christian empire in the world systematically destroying a people who had refused to convert, and doing it close enough that the sound of it carried north. By 793, the Vendel Age was over in all but name. The ships were ready. The warriors were trained and hungry. The political structure had been generating dispossessed young men for 2 centuries. The religious framework told those men that dying in battle was preferable to dying in obscurity. The sail had opened the North Atlantic. The Frankish advance had advertised the wealth of Christian Europe, while simultaneously demonstrating the cost of being its neighbor rather than its predator. Everything that was needed was in place. What happened at Lindisfarne was not a surprise eruption of violence from a primitive world. It was the first visible deployment of a system that had been under construction for 250 years. A Norse chieftain in the late 8th century might have one legal wife installed at the center of his household with her own authority over the domestic world of the farm, and 2 or 3 concubines besides. The concubines were not hidden. They were not shameful. They were a visible marker of his wealth and status, proof that he could feed more mouths than other men, clothe more bodies, command the loyalty of more women and more children. A man who could afford only one woman was a man of limited means. A man who could afford several was a man of consequence. The church, when it eventually arrived, would find this arrangement intolerable. For the Norse world of the 8th century, it was simply what success looked like. The arithmetic consequences of this arrangement were severe, and almost nobody talked about them. But if the most powerful men in a community each claimed 2 or 3 women as permanent partners, the number of women available for ordinary free men to marry shrank accordingly. A young farmer's son who wanted to establish his own household, take a wife, have children, and anchor himself in the social world needed something the system was already distributing to his betters. He was not unusual. In a society with a roughly equal number of men and women at birth, yet the monopolization of women by the elite produced a structural surplus of unmarried men at the bottom, men with the biological drive to find partners and the social urgency to establish households, and nothing in the existing order available to satisfy either need. Land made the problem worse. Norse inheritance customs in most regions gave the farm to the eldest son, or divided it among sons in proportions that left the youngest with shares too small to support a family. A chieftain with 3 sons had one farm. The eldest would inherit the core of it. The others would inherit enough to remind them what they were missing. Across a single generation, the arithmetic was manageable. Across 3 or 4 generations of population growth on a fixed and limited agricultural base, it produced something close to a structural crisis. The land could not expand. The sons kept coming. The households that could absorb them as laborers were already full. The alternative was the sea. The young man this system produced had a specific character. He had grown up in a warrior culture that told him his worth was measured in what he could take and what he could hold. He had probably trained with weapons from childhood. He understood the obligations of the retinue, the honor economy of the hall, the social logic of violence as a path to status. He was physically capable, often ferociously so. And he had nothing, no land, no wife, no hall of his own, and no future that the existing social order was prepared to hand him. His name would be remembered as nobody if he stayed. The Norse had a word for a man who died without honor, without deeds, without the kind of life that could be spoken aloud in the hall. He was forgotten. Forgotten was the worst thing a person could be. Thralls, slaves, were already a foundation of Scandinavian life long before the first overseas raid. Every substantial Norse farm ran on their labor. They cleared the forest and dug the channels, cut the hay, and performed the work that free men considered beneath their dignity. They were property, acquired through local raiding, through debt, through birth to enslaved mothers. The demand for them was constant, and the supply from local sources was finite. When the longship reached the range of the Irish coast and the English shore, it found something the Norse economy had been hungry for all along, not just silver and portable wealth, but bodies. The raid was a labor acquisition expedition as much as it was a wealth acquisition expedition, and the monasteries and coastal villages of the British Isles were full of people who could be taken. The successful raider came home transformed. He carried silver, enough to buy land, pay a bride price, equip himself as a man of standing. He carried thralls, enough to work a farm that now required more labor than his family alone could provide. That he had done what the social order demanded and rewarded. He had gone out with nothing and come back with something. The hall noticed. The chieftains noticed. Other young men with nothing noticed above all. A single successful raid did not change a man's life in the abstract. It changed it in the most concrete terms imaginable. It gave him the material basis to be a person in a world that measured persons in land and livestock and the labor of others. The women left behind during the raiding seasons were not passive figures in this economy. A Norse farm wife managed the household in her husband's absence with a level of authority that had no equivalent in most of contemporary Christian Europe. The keys to the storerooms hung at her belt, a literal and symbolic marker of her control over the farm's reserves. She made decisions about livestock, about trade, about the welfare of the thralls, about which debts could be paid and which could not. The sagas would later record women who divorced their husbands for cowardice, who managed estates for decades while their men were abroad, who appear in the legal record as property owners in their own right. The raiding economy did not diminish women. It required them to be capable of running everything in a man's absence, and it selected over time for women who were. The feedback loop, once started, was self-reinforcing in a way that made it almost impossible to stop from within. A man who went raiding and succeeded came back with the resources to acquire status and partners. A man who stayed home accumulated nothing beyond what the land could slowly produce. Over time, the men who raided were more likely to leave descendants, and those descendants grew up in households where raiding was the known mechanism for advancement, where the equipment was available, where the knowledge was transmitted by fathers who had done it and survived. Raiding did not need to be commanded or organized from above to persist. It was individually rational for the men who had no other option, profitable for the chieftains who organized and led it, and embedded in a cultural and religious framework that told everyone involved it was exactly what they were supposed to be doing. The chieftains who led the raids were not acting against their own interests. A successful raid brought them silver to redistribute, thralls to assign, a reputation to trade on, and, most importantly, the loyalty of the young men who had followed them and come home richer. The gift economy that sat at the heart of Norse political life ran on incoming wealth. A chieftain who stopped producing wealth for his retinue, stopped being a chieftain. Raiding was not a habit the elite could easily set aside even if they had wanted to, because the entire structure of their authority depended on its continuation. The lord needed the raid as much as the landless young man did. The interests of the top and the bottom of Norse society converged across the late 8th century on exactly the same activity. The target was not chosen at random. Norse traders had been visiting the coasts of Britain and Ireland for generations before the first armed longships arrived, carrying furs, amber, and walrus ivory south in exchange for silver, wine, and the manufactured goods that Scandinavian craftsmen could not produce at home. Those traders knew the coastlines, they knew the rivers. They knew which settlements were wealthy and which were defended and which were neither. When the longships came, they did not come blind. They came with intelligence gathered over decades of peaceful contact, guided by men who had walked those shores as merchants and returned to describe what they had seen. The raid at Lindisfarne was not an improvisation. It was the violent application of existing knowledge to an existing opportunity by men who had every social, economic, and structural reason in the world to take it. A Norse shipwright did not work from drawings. There were no drawings. He worked from memory, his own and his father's before him, and his father's fathers before that. He knew the shape of a hull the way a skilled carpenter knows the grain of wood, not as a set of measurements to be followed, but as a living understanding of how forces moved through a structure where strength was needed and where flexibility served better than rigidity. He selected his timber by eye, choosing trees that had grown curved in the right directions, splitting planks along the grain rather than sawing across it, because a split plank was stronger than a sawn one, and he knew it, or even if he could not have explained the physics. The knowledge that produced the longship was not written anywhere. It lived in hands, in eyes, in the accumulated judgment of men who had spent their lives building things that had to survive the open North Atlantic. The fundamental principle of the hull was the overlapping plank, the clinker method, in which each strake of oak lay across the top edge of the one below it, the joint sealed with tarred wool or animal hair, the whole assembly riveted together with iron nails whose ends were hammered flat over iron washers on the inside of the hull. The result was a skin of wood that was simultaneously rigid and flexible, rigid enough to hold its shape under load, flexible enough to absorb the twisting forces of open water waves without cracking. A Mediterranean hull of the same period was built around an internal frame first, with planks attached to it afterwards. The Norse hull was built from the outside in. The shell came first, and the internal framing was added afterwards to support a structure that already held itself together. The difference in philosophy produced a different kind of ship entirely, lighter, more responsive, more alive in the water. The keel was the spine of everything. A single timber of oak running the full length of the hull gave the ship its structural backbone and, more importantly, its directional stability in the water. Without a true keel, a hull pushed sideways by a crosswind would slip and drift, making controlled navigation almost impossible in any conditions other than a following wind. With it, a ship could be steered with precision, could hold a course across open water, and, when the mast was stepped into the keelson above it, could carry the downward thrust of a sail without tearing itself apart. The keel was not a dramatic innovation in isolation. It was the piece that made everything else work. The sail arrived late in Scandinavian shipbuilding, almost certainly borrowed from contact with Frisian and Frankish merchants who had been using square rigs in the southern North Sea for generations. It was a large square panel of woven wool, heavy, dense, capable of holding wind without stretching out of shape, hung from a single yard on a mast stepped amidships. Wool was not an obvious choice for a sail. Linen or hemp would have been lighter, but wool held its weave under tension and retained some water resistance and was available in the quantities a Norse household economy could produce. An entire community's worth of women spent months at the loom producing a single sail. The finished article might weigh over 100 kilograms and last, with maintenance, for the life of the ship. What the sail did to the operational range of a Norse vessel was transformative beyond any simple multiplication of distance. Before the sail, a raiding crew's effective range was limited by their physical endurance at the oar, perhaps 60 to 80 kilometers per day, before exhaustion degraded their fighting capability on arrival. Under sail in a good wind, the same vessel covered 200 kilometers, with the crew resting, eating, sleeping, arriving at their destination with their strength intact. The crossing from western Norway to the Scottish coast, roughly 350 kilometers, became a voyage of 2 days rather than a week of brutal rowing. Orkney, Shetland, the Faroe Islands moved from the edge of reach to routine destinations. Iceland, 1,700 kilometers from the Norwegian coast, moved from the unimaginable to the merely challenging. The draft of the longship was its other great military secret and the one most consistently underestimated. The hull was extraordinarily shallow. A vessel 30 meters long and capable of carrying 60 warriors drew less than a meter of water. This meant it could be beached directly on any open shore, bow first, with the crew stepping off into the shallows and onto dry land in one continuous motion, without the delay of finding a harbor, dropping anchor, or lowering boats. It could navigate rivers that no deep-hulled vessel could enter, ni pushing inland to targets that considered themselves protected by geography. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Thames, the Dnieper, all of them were longship roads. The communities that had built their defenses around the assumption that the sea was a barrier discovered that the sea was a highway that ended at their front door. The Norse built more than one kind of ship, and the distinction matters. The longship, narrow, shallow, fast, built for warriors and oars, was the raiding vessel. Yet the Nar was something different, broader, deeper, higher-sided, built for cargo rather than speed, dependent primarily on sail because the crew was too small to row it effectively. It was the Nar that fed colonization. Longships could raid Iceland. Nars carried the cattle, the timber, the seed grain, the household goods, the women and children and thralls that turned a raid into a settlement. And the popular image collapses the two into one and loses something essential in the process. The Viking Age was not only a military event, it was a migration, and the migration ran on cargo ships that nobody makes films about. The portage, carrying ships overland between river systems, was a capability that the longship's light weight made possible, and that no other contemporary vessel could match. A Norse crew could haul their ship out of one river, drag it across a watershed on log rollers, and launch it into a different river running in a different direction. This was how the Rus, Norse traders and warriors operating in the eastern river systems, moved between the Baltic and the Black Sea, crossing from the rivers running west to the rivers running south and arriving eventually at Constantinople. A ship that could go everywhere by water and be carried between waterways by its own crew was not a vessel. It was a system of mobility without precedent in the medieval world. Building a longship was a community event, not an individual one. A vessel 30 meters long required hundreds of oak trees selected, felled, and seasoned over years. It required iron in quantities that strained the output of local bloomery furnaces. It required rope, tar, wool for the sail and caulking, and the labor of skilled craftsmen working for months. No single farm family could produce one. A great hall with its tributary farms and its thralls and its access to regional trade networks could, but only barely, and only by treating the ship as the primary object of investment for a season or more. Ship ownership was power in the Norse world, not merely because a ship carried warriors, but because the capacity to build and maintain one was itself a demonstration of the resources and the political reach required to command that kind of collective effort. The longship was not invincible, and the Norse knew it. It was vulnerable in storms because its shallow draft and low freeboard made it dangerous in heavy beam seas. It could not carry the provisions for a very long voyage without sacrificing the crew space that made it a fighting vessel. It was flammable in a way that a stone fortress was not. And it required a skilled crew to function at all, 30 men who knew their oar positions, their sail drill, their stations in a fight. Men who had trained together and trusted each other in the way that only shared danger could produce. The longship did not win because it was perfect. It won because no one who faced it had anything remotely comparable, and because the society that built it had spent 1,000 years developing exactly the kind of men it needed to sail it. A Norse warrior going into battle was not fighting alone. He was fighting inside a cosmology that had been built over centuries. Now, to make exactly what he was doing feel not just acceptable, but sacred, the highest possible expression of what a human life could be. The gods he worshipped were not distant, benevolent figures who rewarded virtue and punished cruelty. They were specific, dangerous, and deeply interested in war. They needed warriors the way warriors needed them. The relationship was not one of supplicant and deity. It was something closer to a mutual arrangement. One, and the warrior who understood it, understood that his death in battle was not a tragedy. It was a promotion. The universe the Norse inhabited was built on a great ash tree called Yggdrasil, whose roots reached into 9 distinct worlds and whose branches held the realm of gods, the realm of men, the realm of frost giants, and the realm of the dead. At its roots, a serpent gnawed ceaselessly at the wood, working always toward the day when the tree would fall and the cosmos with it. This was not a metaphor the Norse held at a comfortable distance. The world was going to end. The gods knew it. Odin had spent centuries preparing for it. The destruction of everything was written into the structure of reality, and the only question open to a man was what he would be doing when it came. Odin sat at the center of this cosmology, and he was nothing like the divine kings of other traditions. He was one-eyed because he had traded the other eye for a drink from the well of wisdom. He had hanged himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days to learn the runes. He wandered the world in disguise, testing men, betraying those he favored when it served his purpose, and gathering knowledge with a hunger that never quieted. He was the god of wisdom, death, poetry, and desperate gambles. His worshippers were not the men who expected to win cleanly. They were the men who understood that the odds were against them and went anyway, because going was what the situation demanded. Odin's hall was Valhalla, the hall of the slain. Its roof was thatched with shields, its rafters were spears, its benches were breastplates. Every evening, the warriors Odin had chosen from the battlefields of the world feasted together, drinking mead that flowed without limit from a goat standing on the roof. Every morning they armed themselves and fought each other in the yard until the dead rose again for the feast. This was not paradise as rest. It was paradise as perpetual readiness. Young Odin was building an army for Ragnarok, the final battle, and the men in his hall were his recruits, selected on the basis of their performance in the only audition that counted: how they had died. The Valkyries moved across every battlefield, invisible to the living, choosing among the fallen. Their name meant choosers of the slain, and the choice they made was neither random nor based on who won. It was based on who had fought well enough to be worth keeping. A man who died bravely in a losing cause was more likely to be taken than a man who survived through cowardice in a winning one. The theology made the outcome of a battle irrelevant to the question of whether a man had acquitted himself properly. Victory was good. Dying well was better. The two were not the same, and the Norse knew it. What this cosmology produced in practical terms was a fighting force that was genuinely difficult to intimidate. And a Norse warrior who believed in Valhalla, and the evidence from the sagas and the runestones suggests that many of them did, in the lived, functional way that people believe things that organize their behavior, was not afraid of death in the way that his opponents were. He was afraid of the wrong kind of death. A death in bed from sickness, in old age, was a death in hell, the gray, cold realm of the undistinguished dead, where nothing heroic had ever happened and nothing ever would. A death on a beach with a sword in your hand, surrounded by the men of your ship, was the door to something else entirely. The asymmetry between these two destinations shaped every decision a warrior made from the moment he picked up a weapon. The concept of ninid, the social stigma of unmanliness, was the mechanism that enforced the warrior cosmology at the level of daily life. To be called a nidinger was the gravest possible insult in the Norse world, implying cowardice, moral failure, and a kind of social death worse than the physical kind. A man accused of enanyidi was required to respond with violence or be proven by his silence to deserve the label. The Icelandic law books specified that certain insults of this kind gave the recipient the legal right to kill the speaker on the spot without penalty. The social system and the religious system converged on the same point. A man who declined to fight when fighting was called for had failed in every way that mattered, and the community would treat him accordingly for the rest of his life. Thor stood at the other end of the divine spectrum from Odin and served a different need. Where Odin was for chieftains, poets, and desperate men making catastrophic bets, Thor was for everyone else. He was large, straightforward, and reliable, a god who hit things when they needed hitting and protected the farmers and the fishing villages and the ordinary households from the giants and monsters that threatened them. His hammer Mjolnir was a tool as much as a weapon, used at weddings and births as well as battles. He was the most widely worshipped deity in the Norse world, precisely because most people were not warriors making desperate gambles. They were farmers who needed the crops to come up and the cattle to survive the winter, and Thor was the god who stood between them and a cosmos that was actively trying to kill them. Loki complicated everything, and he was the trickster, a god who was neither a seer nor giant by full allegiance, who shifted shape and gender and loyalty with an ease that the rest of the pantheon found by turns useful and infuriating. He was the father of Fenrir, the wolf destined to swallow Odin at Ragnarok. He was the mother, in one of his female forms, of Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse. He was the agent of Baldur's death, and the reason the beloved god could not return from hell before the end of the world. Loki's function in the cosmology was to make the doom inevitable, to ensure that Ragnarok could not be averted, that the tree would fall, that the end was coming regardless of what anyone did. A theology that included Loki was a theology that had built the certainty of catastrophe into its own foundations, and the warriors who lived inside it knew that the world was going down and intended to be standing when it did. The Norse had no professional priestly class in the way that Christian Europe had a church. Religion was not a separate institution with its own buildings, its own hierarchy, its own political apparatus. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, into the feasts and the sacrifices, the seasonal blots at which animals and sometimes people were offered to the gods, the blessings said over the prow of a new ship, the oaths sworn over the sacred ring in the chieftain's hall, and the chieftain himself performed many of the religious functions that a priest would have held elsewhere. He was the intermediary between his household and the gods, and his authority derived in part from his ability to perform those rites correctly. Religion was not something the Norse went to. It was something they lived inside. The monasteries of Christian Europe meant something specific to a Norse raider that they did not mean to the raiders of other traditions. They were not merely wealthy targets, though they were certainly that. They were the houses of a rival cosmology, a cosmology that told its adherents that the Norse gods were demons, that the Viking way of life was an offense against the divine order, that the men who came off the longships were damned. Raiding a monastery was not incidentally a religious act, it was directly one. To walk into a building where men prayed to a god who had declared your own gods to be evil, To take what was inside and leave the building burning was to make a statement about whose cosmology was correct. The monks of Lindisfarne believed that God had allowed the raid as punishment for their sins. The men who carried it out believed they had proven something rather different. Before the warming came, the cold, and the cold was catastrophic in ways that historians spent centuries underestimating. In 536 CE, a volcanic eruption somewhere in the northern hemisphere threw enough ash and sulfur into the upper atmosphere to dim the sun across the entire northern world for 18 months. Temperatures dropped. Crops failed across Europe and Central Asia. A famine followed, and in its wake, a plague, the Justinianic plague of 541 CE, moved through a weakened population with a speed and lethality that killed perhaps half the people in some regions. Tree rings from across the northern hemisphere record the narrowest growth bands of the past 2,000 years in the years immediately following 536. It was the beginning of what climate scientists now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of sustained cold and disruption that lasted, with variations, until roughly 660 CE. Scandinavia was not spared. The abandoned settlements, the contracted agriculture, the consolidation of the migration period all took place against a backdrop of a world that had become measurably, lethally colder. The recovery from this cold period was slow and uneven, but by the early 7th century, it was underway. Temperatures began to creep upward. Growing seasons lengthened, modestly at first, and then more substantially. The Scandinavian population, which had contracted sharply during the worst of the migration period and the cold that accompanied it, began to recover and grow. More mouths meant more farms, and more farms meant more cleared land, and more cleared land meant the thin Scandinavian soils were being pushed harder than they had been in generations. The recovery from catastrophe was itself the seed of a new pressure, building slowly through the 7th and into the 8th century, accumulating behind the landscape like water behind an earthen dam. By the 8th century, then temperatures across northern Europe were warmer than they had been in centuries and continuing to rise. The warming was not uniform. It was stronger over the North Atlantic and northern Europe than further south, and it was variable from decade to decade, but the overall trend was clear, and its agricultural consequences were real. Growing seasons in Scandinavia lengthened by days and then by weeks. Lands that had been too cold for reliable cultivation became marginal farmland. Marginal farmland became productive. The carrying capacity of the Norse agricultural world grew, and the population that depended on it grew with it, pressing always against the limit of what the land could hold, never quite escaping the arithmetic that said there were more people than farms. The North Atlantic itself changed. Warmer air temperatures meant a retreating sea ice edge in the waters north and west of Scandinavia. Sailing seasons lengthened. Routes that had been blocked by ice for months were open for months longer. The waters between Norway and the Orkney Islands, between Orkney and Shetland, between Shetland and the Faroes. These had always been navigable in summer, but the margin for error was wider now, the weather windows more reliable, the risk of being caught by an early autumn storm slightly reduced. For men who were already capable sailors with capable ships, this was not the difference between possible and impossible. It was the difference between routine and exceptional. The North Atlantic moved from a place you crossed with great care into a place you crossed with ordinary care, and that shift in the calculus of risk was enough to change everything. Irish monks had reached the Faroe Islands by sea in their small skin boats before the Norse arrived. Probably in the early 7th century, almost certainly by the late 7th. They were looking for solitude, not for the silence of a place where God had not yet been drowned out by the noise of the human world. They found it. The islands were uninhabited, cold, treeless, and extraordinarily remote by any normal measure of distance. The monks had crossed 250 kilometers of open North Atlantic in vessels that a Norse longship would have regarded as toys. Their presence in the Faroes, recorded in the Irish geographical text Dicuil, written around 825 CE, was proof that the route was navigable, that the islands were real, and that the sea to the north and west was not the edge of the world. When Norse settlers arrived in the Faroes in the late 8th century and found traces of Irish habitation, they were not discovering virgin territory. They were following a route that someone else had already proved. The warming climate interacted with the existing population pressure in Scandinavia in a way that made the problem worse before it made it better. Warmer temperatures allowed more people to survive childhood and reach reproductive age. They allowed the marginal farms of the inland valleys to produce slightly more reliable yields, which supported slightly larger families, which required slightly more land in the next generation. The Norse world of the mid-8th century was a world in which a few more people were being born every year than the land could indefinitely support, and the gap between population and carrying capacity was growing slowly, but without any natural ceiling in sight. This was not a crisis yet. It was a gradient, a slow, unsteady pressure that expressed itself not in famine or collapse, but in the accumulation of young men with no land to inherit and no obvious future in the communities that had produced them. The relationship between climate and the Viking Age was not simple, and it was not deterministic. Warmer temperatures did not cause the raids. They adjusted the conditions under which all the other causes operated. They made the North Atlantic more accessible. They made Scandinavian agriculture slightly more productive, which fed slightly more people, which produced slightly more landless young men, which fed the social engine that the raids required. They extended the sailing season in ways that widened the operational window for longships crossing to Britain and Ireland. They opened the western Atlantic routes that would eventually lead to Iceland, Greenland, and North America. The climate was not the story. It was the stage on which the story played out, and the particular shape of that stage in the late 8th century made certain moves possible that would not have been possible a century earlier. The Faroe Islands were settled by Norse colonists in the late 8th century, almost simultaneously with the first raids on Britain. This is not a coincidence. The same conditions that made Britain reachable made the Faroes reachable. The same ships, the same sailors, yet the same extended sailing seasons served both purposes. Some of the men on those early ships were looking for silver and thralls on defended coasts. Others were looking for empty land to farm on undefended islands. Both kinds of men existed, both were produced by the same social pressures, and both were enabled by the same climatic and technological conditions. The Viking Age was simultaneously a wave of violence and a wave of migration. And the two moved together across the North Atlantic because they were driven by the same forces, operating on the same people, in the same warming world. The warming, like all warmings, was not permanent. Temperatures in the North Atlantic began to cool again in the 13th century, and by the 14th, the Little Ice Age was underway, a sustained period of cold that would last, with interruptions, until the 19th century. The Norse settlements in Greenland, established during the warmth of the 10th century, found themselves by the 14th in a world that was becoming too cold for the marginal cattle farming that had sustained them. They disappeared between roughly 1360 and 1460, leaving their stone churches and their bone middens and an enduring mystery about exactly what happened at the end. The climate that had opened the North Atlantic and helped produce the Viking Age eventually closed it again, and the world the Norse had built at its furthest edges proved unable to survive the change. Climate, in the end, is the frame around everything else. The late antique cold produced the demographic contraction and military consolidation of the migration period. The recovery and subsequent warming produced the population growth that filled the Vendel period halls with young men who needed more than the land could give them. The 8th century warmth opened the sea routes and extended the sailing seasons that made the raids possible. And the eventual cooling ended the age of expansion by closing the North Atlantic frontier, that the warmth had opened. The Vikings did not make their world. Their world made them. And the temperature of the North Atlantic was part of that world, shaping what was possible and what was not, across every generation from the first cleared field to the last abandoned farm in Greenland. Yes, in 772 CE, Charlemagne marched an army into Saxony and destroyed the Irminsul, a great sacred pillar, probably a massive standing tree trunk that represented the axis holding the Saxon cosmos together. He did not destroy it incidentally, as a side effect of military operations. He destroyed it deliberately, as a statement. The Saxons worshipped demons in the Frankish theological framework, and their sacred objects were the physical infrastructure of demonic power. Removing them was not desecration, it was liberation. The Franks understood themselves to be doing God's work, and the most powerful Christian king in Europe had decided that God's work in the coming decades would be conducted in Saxony, with iron and fire, until the last pagan above the Rhine had been baptized or killed. The Norse world, which shared a land border with Saxony and shared with the Saxons a religion, a language, and a way of organizing the world, watched what was coming from a distance that shortened every year. The Saxons were kin. Not in any formal political sense. There was no Saxon-Norse alliance, no common king, no treaty of mutual defense, but in the way that matters more than politics at the level of a culture. They spoke languages close enough to be mutually intelligible. They worshipped the same gods under slightly different names. They organized their societies around the same warrior retinue structures, the same honor codes, the same relationship between chieftain and hall. When Frankish missionaries crossed the Rhine to tell Saxon farmers that their gods were demons and their ancestors were burning in hell, they were delivering a message that could be heard, with only minor translation, in every Norse hall from Denmark to the northern fjords. The enemy that the Saxons were fighting was the same enemy that would eventually come for everyone who refused to kneel to the Christian God. The Saxon resistance was led, across the worst years of the war, by a chieftain named Widukind, a man who understood exactly what Charlemagne's campaign meant for the world he lived in and refused to accept it for as long as he could. When the pressure became unbearable, Widukind did not surrender. He fled north to the Danes, to the court of the Danish king Sigefrid, where he was sheltered, and where his knowledge of Frankish military methods and political intentions became immediately useful to people who needed to think clearly about what was building on their southern border. The Saxon War was not an abstract event to the Danes. Widukind made it personal. In October 782, after a Saxon rebellion destroyed a Frankish army in the Suntel Hills, Charlemagne gathered the survivors and the Saxon prisoners at the confluence of the Aller and the Weser rivers, near the town of Verden. 4,500 Saxons were beheaded in a single day. The sentence was carried out without trial, without appeal, and without any apparent concern for the propaganda consequences, or perhaps with a very clear understanding of exactly what message was being sent. The men who died at Verden had rebelled against Christian authority. If the men who heard about it and were not yet under Christian authority had just received a detailed account of what submission looked like when the alternative was refused. The news reached Denmark quickly. The Norse world ran on oral information, on traders and travelers and the crews of ships who carried news along with cargo. And a massacre of 4,500 men at a named location was exactly the kind of event that moved fast through those networks. A Danish chieftain who heard about Verden in the winter of 782 understood several things simultaneously: that the Franks were capable of systematic, industrialized violence on a scale that dwarfed anything in the Norse experience, that the Saxons, who had resisted for 10 years, were losing, and that the border between the Frankish world and the Norse world was not a fixed line, but a moving one, and it was moving north. Charlemagne followed Verden with legislation. The Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, the Saxon Capitulary, made death the penalty for a list of offenses that included eating meat during Lent, cremating the dead in the pagan manner, refusing baptism, and consulting a soothsayer. Paganism was not merely discouraged, it was made a capital crime. A Saxon who continued to practice the religion of his ancestors after a certain date was, by Frankish law, eligible for execution. The Norse chieftains who learned of this legislation, and they did learn of it because the Frankish and Danish worlds were in constant diplomatic and commercial contact, were looking at a document that treated their own religious practices as crimes punishable by death. The abstract threat of Frankish expansion had acquired a specific, legal, lethal shape. The Frankish pressure produced a Danish military response. Around 808 CE, just 15 years after Lindisfarne, the Danish king Godfred launched a major raid on the Frankish allied Slavic people of the southern Baltic coast, destroyed their trading center at Rewritten, and forcibly relocated its merchants to Hedeby, the great Danish emporium at the base of the Jutland Peninsula. He then reportedly boasted that he would bring the war to Charlemagne's own hall. Charlemagne was preparing a retaliatory campaign when Godfred was killed by one of his own men in 810. The war did not happen, but the exchange revealed something important. The Danes were not merely reacting to Frankish pressure. They were actively managing it, using military force to reshape the political and economic geography of their southern border, and they were doing so with a confidence that suggested they did not regard the Frankish Empire as an existential threat, so much as a competitor to be outmaneuvered. Charlemagne's campaigns also functioned unintentionally as the most effective advertisement for the wealth of Christian Europe that the Norse world had ever received. The Saxon poet, writing about the Frankish campaigns, described Charlemagne's armies returning from Saxony laden with plunder, gold, silver, livestock, and people, in language that read almost identically to the Anglo-Saxon chronicles' descriptions of Viking raids. The Frankish king was, by any honest accounting, doing to the Saxons precisely what the Norse would shortly do to the English. The difference was the cross. And from a Norse perspective, the cross was not a moral distinction. It was a brand mark on a certain kind of wealth that could be found in certain kinds of buildings, concentrated along certain kinds of coasts, defended by men who had been told by their religion not to fight back. By the time Lindisfarne was raided in 793, Charlemagne had been at war with the Saxons for 21 years. The border between the Christian Frankish world and the pagan Norse world had contracted to the Ida River at the base of the Jutland Peninsula. Beyond that line, the Danish kingdom maintained its independence, but everyone on both sides of the line understood that the line was under pressure. The Norse response to that pressure was not to build a wall. It was to go to sea. Turning toward the ocean meant turning away from the threat on land and what the ocean offered in the coastlines of Britain, Ireland, and Francia itself was an answer to the pressure that the Frankish Empire had been building for 2 decades. Charlemagne had, without intending to, pointed the Viking Age in the direction it would travel. In the summer of 789, 3 ships appeared off the coast of Dorset. It is in southern England. A royal official named Beduhard rode down to the shore to meet them, assuming probably that they were Frisian traders, the kind of northern merchants who appeared regularly along the English coast and whose business was familiar and welcome. He rode toward them to arrange their customs formalities. The men from the ships killed him. This is the first recorded Norse attack on English soil, 4 years before Lindisfarne, and it appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle almost as an aside, a strange, violent incident whose significance nobody quite grasped at the time. The men on those 3 ships had not come to trade, but nobody yet understood what they had come to do because the pattern was not yet visible. It would become visible in 4 years. The monastery at Lindisfarne sat on a tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, connected to the mainland at low tide by a causeway of wet sand and otherwise surrounded by the North Sea. It had stood since 635 CE, founded by the Irish monk Aidan from Iona. And in the century and a half since its founding, it had become one of the most significant religious sites in the Christian world. The home of the Lindisfarne Gospels, an illuminated manuscript of extraordinary beauty and value. The resting place of St. Cuthbert, the most venerated saint in northern England. It had an accumulation of silver, gold, jeweled reliquaries, and church plate that reflected a century and a half of donations from wealthy and pious Northumbrian aristocrats who wanted to express their devotion in the most durable material available. The monastery was, in the language of the people who would shortly arrive, a hoard. It sat on an island accessible only from one direction by land, its walls designed to keep out the weather rather than an armed assault. Its inhabitants committed to a theology of nonviolence, and its location on the coast visible from the sea to any ship passing north or south along the Northumbrian coast. The longships came from the north, almost certainly from western Norway. The exact number is not recorded. The raid was fast, the kind of military operation that depends entirely on surprise and speed, that fails if the defenders have time to organize. And that succeeded here completely because nobody on Lindisfarne had imagined it was possible. The monks had no walls worth the name, and no weapons, and no experience of violence on this scale. The raiders knew exactly where the valuables were kept, because sacred objects in Christian communities were displayed rather than hidden. The reliquaries in the church, the plate in the sacristy, the library in its dedicated building. Within hours, the portable wealth of a century and a half of pious donation was loaded onto the ships. Some monks were killed, others were taken. The ships pushed back into the North Sea and were gone. The scholar Alcuin of York, the most respected intellectual in the Carolingian world, heard about the raid while he was at Charlemagne's court. He wrote letters to the king of Northumbria, to the bishop, to the monks who had survived, in language that made clear the event had registered as something categorically different from ordinary violence. He described it as a punishment from God, visited upon the English for their sins. The heathens had come from the north, as the prophet Jeremiah had written that evil would come, and the English were not to ask why this had happened, but to examine their consciences for the sins that had made it possible. Alcuin had no framework for understanding the raid as a strategic event, a rational act by men responding to comprehensible pressures. For him, it was a theological problem. For the Norse, it had been an economic one, and they had solved it very efficiently. The intelligence that made Lindisfarne possible had been accumulating for decades. Norse traders moved regularly along the northern and western coasts of Britain, selling furs and walrus ivory and amber in exchange for silver and wine and the manufactured goods that Scandinavian craftsmen could not match. Those traders had walked through every significant port town and coastal settlement in northern England. They knew the monasteries by name and by reputation. They knew which ones were wealthy and which were merely prestigious. They knew the tides, the coastal approaches, the places where a longship could beach without being seen from the land until it was already close. The raid at Lindisfarne was not a discovery. It was an application of existing knowledge to an opportunity that had existed for years, executed by men who had been building the capability to exploit it for a generation. Why 793 and not 783 or 773? The question has a real answer. In 773, the sail had not yet fully transformed Norse operational range. In the ships of that period were capable coastal vessels, but the crossing from western Norway to Northumberland, over 700 kilometers of open North Sea, was at the outer edge of what was reliably possible without a sail, and it left the crew exhausted on arrival. By 793, a decade or more of experience with the rigged longship had made that crossing routine. The sailors who beached at Lindisfarne arrived rested enough to fight. In 773, they probably could not have. Yet the technology closed the gap between possible and operational in the decade before the raids began, and the raids began almost as soon as the gap closed. The Frankish pressure on Saxony had, by 793, been running for 21 years. The implications for the Norse world had been clear since at least the massacre of Verden in 782. A generation of Danish and Norwegian chieftains had grown up understanding that the Christian empire to the south was expanding, and that paganism was being systematically destroyed along the Frankish frontier, and that the border was not stable. Some of them drew the conclusion that the appropriate response was to strengthen the southern defenses. Others drew a different conclusion, that if the Christian world was going to be an enemy regardless, it might as well be a profitable one. The men who raided Lindisfarne had chosen the second option. They had turned the threat that pressed from the south into an argument for going west. The word spread fast. A successful raid produced something more valuable than silver in the short term: information. The crews who came back from Lindisfarne knew what the English coast contained, how it was defended, how fast the local response could be organized, and how much could be taken in how short a time. Now that knowledge moved through the Norse world along the same networks that carried trade goods and political intelligence, through the halls, through the markets, through the conversations of men at the oar bench during the long passages between home and the raiding grounds. Within a season, the outlines of what Lindisfarne had offered were known to every ambitious young man in western Norway and Denmark who had a ship or access to one. Within a decade, the raids had spread from Northumberland to Ireland, to the Frankish coast, and up the rivers into the interior of a continent that had assumed it was protected by its distance from the sea. The monasteries fell first and hardest because they combined in a single location all the qualities that made a target ideal. They were wealthy, the accumulated donations of generations of aristocrats. They were visible, built on headlands and islands expressly to be seen and reached by the faithful. They were undefended, their inhabitants committed to a religious practice that did not include violence. And they were isolated, placed outside the towns and settlements specifically to distance the monks from the noise and corruption of the secular world, which also meant to distance them from anyone who might arrive quickly enough to help. The Norse had not engineered these qualities. The Christian practice of monastic life had engineered them over centuries, yet without any awareness that it was building a target. The raid on Lindisfarne was not the beginning of the Viking Age. It was the moment the Viking Age became visible to the people it was going to spend the next 2 centuries dismantling. Stand on the shore at Lindisfarne on a June morning in 793, and you can see the whole of it from there. Behind you, a monastery that represents everything the Christian world values: learning, sanctity, beauty, wealth consecrated to God. Ahead of you, in the North Sea, flat and gray and enormous, and somewhere beyond it, a world that has been building toward this moment for 1,000 years. The ships have not yet appeared on the horizon, but the forces that filled them, the dispossessed sons, the hungry chieftains, the theology of the honourable death, the sail that made the crossing possible, the traders who had already been here and knew exactly what was inside those walls. All of it is already in motion. The ships are coming. The only question that was ever open was when. The sagas were not written during the Viking Age. They were written after it, in Iceland mostly, between the 12th and 14th centuries, by men who were trying to make sense of a world that had already passed. The raids on Lindisfarne were 200 years old when the first saga writers put ink to vellum. The great chieftains who had led the early expeditions to England and Ireland were separated from the men who wrote about them by the same distance that separates us today from the English Civil War. In that gap, the oral tradition had done what oral traditions always do. It had compressed, amplified, combined, and simplified. Individual men with complicated histories had been absorbed into composite figures who carried, in a single name, the accumulated deeds of an entire generation. The question that matters is not whether those composite figures actually existed. The question is what the society that built them needed them to say. Ragnar Lodbrok almost certainly did not exist as the sagas describe him. A single man who raided Britain, sacked Paris, slew a dragon, fathered the most famous sons in the Norse world, and died composing poetry in a snake pit while the venom worked through his veins. What probably existed was a Ragnar of some kind, perhaps the chieftain who led the raid on Paris in 845 and was paid an enormous sum in silver to leave. And around that kernel, the oral tradition accumulated the deeds of other men, other raids, other victories that deserved to be remembered but had no single name large enough to carry them. By the time the sagas were written, Ragnar had become a vessel. Into him went everything the Norse world most wanted to believe about itself. And the nickname Lodbrok meant hairy breeches or shaggy breeches, a reference in the legend to the leather trousers he supposedly wore when killing the dragon that stood between him and his first wife. It was not a flattering name by any obvious standard, but in the Norse world, a memorable nickname was itself a kind of honor. To be called Bloodaxe or Ironside or Snake in the Eye was to have your defining quality, your ferocity, your toughness, your uncanny nature permanently attached to your name in a form that could not be removed. Ragnar's nickname attached to him the quality of a man who faced monsters in improvised armor and won. The dignity was in the doing, not in the elegance of the description. His sons were probably real, at least in outline. Ivar, who led the great heathen army into England in 865 with somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 warriors, the largest Norse force yet to land on English soil, appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle under his own name at the head of a military operation of genuine historical consequence. Bjorn Ironside appears in Frankish sources as a leader of raids along the Atlantic coast in the 860s. Halfdan appears in the Chronicle as a leader of the Danish army that wintered in England and began the process of settlement. These were real men doing documented things. What the saga tradition did was attach them, collectively, to a single father figure whose legend gave their coalition the gravity of a dynasty rather than the messiness of a military alliance assembled from competing interests and shared ambition. The device of the legendary father served a specific political purpose. A group of Norse chieftains claiming to share a father, even a father who was mostly legend, could present their alliance as something more durable and more binding than a military agreement between men who might, under different circumstances, be enemies. Descent from Ragnar was a claim to a kind of legitimacy that no living man could easily challenge, because Ragnar himself was already moving beyond the reach of verification. So several Norse and later Scandinavian royal houses claimed descent from him, not because they necessarily believed it literally, but because the claim did political work that a more honest account of their origins would not have done. Ivar the Boneless presented his own problems. The nickname was recorded. He was called Boneless in contemporary sources close enough to the events to matter, but nobody wrote down what it meant, and the silence is itself interesting. A man whose defining characteristic was considered so obvious it needed no explanation, in a world where nicknames were functional rather than decorative, was probably a man with a physical reality behind the name. He may have been extraordinarily flexible, a quality that in a fighter was genuinely useful and genuinely strange. He may have had a condition that affected his bones or his movement. Now, he may have been called boneless in the sense of being pitiless, a man who broke the bones of others without mercy. None of these explanations is proven. All of them were circulating in the Norse world while he was still alive, and all of them added to the sense that he was not quite like other men. The sagas almost entirely excluded women from the fighting world. Almost, but not completely. And the exception matters. In the trading town of Birka in central Sweden in the 10th century, a woman was buried with a sword, an axe, a spear, 2 shields, 2 horses, armor-piercing arrows, and a set of gaming pieces that suggested a mind trained in the tactics of command. Everything about the burial placed her among the highest-ranking warriors of her community. She had not been buried as a wife or a mother or a keeper of keys. She had been buried as what she apparently was, a commander. A person whose life had been organized around violence and strategy in exactly the manner that the Norse world reserved, almost exclusively, for men. She was not the only one. She was simply the most completely preserved. The sagas did not write women like her into the record. The ground kept the evidence anyway. The saga tradition was political technology as much as it was literature. In 13th century Iceland, when most of the great sagas were being written down, now the island's leading families were in the middle of a vicious internal conflict over power and land that would eventually end Icelandic independence altogether. Into this context, the saga writers brought the stories of the settlement age. The great chieftains who had come from Norway and carved out farms and domains in the new land, whose descendants were the very families now fighting over what those domains had become. To have a saga written about your ancestor was to have your family's claim to status and land placed in a form that could be read aloud in a hall and could not easily be disputed. The legends were weapons, deployed in arguments that were very much about the present. What the composite heroes reveal underneath the narrative machinery of the sagas, just as a society that had a very clear idea of what it valued and a very clear need to see those values embodied in a human form large enough to contain them. Courage without limit, cunning without scruple, loyalty that held even when the cause was lost. The ability to face death not only without fear, but with something close to relish, composing poetry in a snake pit, because the alternative, silence, submission, yet the admission that the end was unwelcome, was simply not available to a man of honor. The legends did not describe men who had actually lived. They described the man every Norse warrior was supposed to become, held at a scale that made the standard visible from a great distance. The Viking Age built 2 things simultaneously, and they are equally important. It built a material world, settlements, trade routes, political structures, in the genetic legacy of a diaspora that reached from Greenland to Constantinople, and it built a legendary world, a set of stories about who the Norse were and what they had done that outlasted the material world by centuries and is still operating today in the films and the television series and the tattoos and the cultural appropriations of a people who have been dead for 1,000 years. The legends are not separate from the history. They are part of it, the part that tells us, most directly, what the Viking Age understood itself to be doing while it was happening. The monk who survived Lindisfarne in 793 and lived long enough to be old understood the event as a punishment. God's wrath visited on a sinful people, arriving from the sea in the form of men who had no business being there. He was not wrong that something had arrived. He was wrong about almost everything else. What came off the water that June morning was not a punishment and not an aberration. It was the leading edge of a system that had been assembling itself for 1,000 years in a landscape too cold and too thin to support the people it kept producing, in a society that had developed across centuries of pressure and violence and contact with the wider world, precisely the technology, the ideology, and the social structure required to turn that landscape's limitations into a military advantage. The monk had no way of knowing any of this. But the men who killed his brothers and took his silver and pushed their ships back into the North Sea understood it completely, even if they could not have said it in so many words. They understood it in their bodies, in the calluses on their oar hands, and the weight of the sword at their hip, and the particular quality of attention a man develops when the sea is his road, and the road goes everywhere. The Viking Age was not a beginning, and every popular account treats it as one. as if the Norse emerged from nowhere in 793 and proceeded to terrorize the world for 2.5 centuries before being tamed by Christianity and the consolidating force of the medieval state. The emergence was real. The nowhere was not. Behind Lindisfarne stood the Vendel Age with its boat graves and its Odinic warrior theology. Behind the Vendel Age stood the Migration period with its consolidating chieftains and its rivers of Roman gold. And behind the Migration period stood the Germanic Iron Age with its warrior retinues and its bog offerings and its slow accumulation of the naval tradition that would eventually produce the longship. Behind all of it stood the 3 genetic streams that mixed on the Scandinavian peninsula across 5,000 years, producing a population that was never the racially homogeneous warrior people of popular imagination, but always something more complicated, more mobile, more open to the world and its possibilities than the legend admits. It ended for the same reasons it began, operating in reverse. The internal frontier closed first. The farmable land of Iceland was fully settled within a generation of the first Norse arrival, and Greenland's marginal agricultural capacity was apparent to everyone who tried to work it. The political structures that the Viking Age had itself disrupted began to consolidate. England, under Alfred and his successors, developed a coherent military response, building fortified towns, the burhs, that denied the longship its key tactical advantage of surprise. The Frankish Empire fragmented, but its fragments became kingdoms with walls and standing forces of their own. Christianity spread north, not through military conquest, but through the conversion of the Norse aristocracy. And with Christianity came a network of political and economic relationships that made raiding your trading partner theologically and commercially inconvenient. The dispossessed sons still existed, but the world they could raid was shrinking, and the world that offered land and wives through settlement was also, slowly, filling up. The genetic legacy of what the Viking Age produced is still measurable in the living population of the North Atlantic world. Iceland was settled almost entirely by Norsemen and Irish and Scottish women, taken, traded, or who came willingly. And the Icelandic population today carries both genetic streams in roughly equal measure. In Normandy, the Norse settlers who arrived in the early 10th century absorbed the local Frankish population within 3 generations, their descendants speaking French, converting to Christianity, yes, and a century and a half later, conquering England at Hastings under a duke whose great-great-great-grandfather had been a Norse chieftain named Rollo. In Ireland, the long forts, the fortified Norse harbors established in the 9th century, became the cities of Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. In Russia, the Rus gave a country its name. The Norse diaspora did not end when the raiding ended. It dissolved into the populations it had encountered and left its mark in the bones of people who do not think of themselves as Norse at all. The legend outlasted the reality because it was doing something the reality alone could not do. The reality was complicated. Mixed populations, commercial motives, seasonal raiders who were also farmers and traders and fathers, a world driven by land scarcity and social pressure, and the specific mechanics of inheritance. The legend was simple. Great men, great deeds, great deaths, the gods watching from above and the poets watching from below, both of them keeping score. Simple stories survive. Complicated ones require the kind of sustained attention that most ages cannot afford. The 19th century found the legend and used it for its own purposes: nationalism, racial theory, the construction of heroic ancestors for peoples who needed them. The 21st century found it again and used it for different purposes. But the hunger underneath was the same, the desire for a world where identity was clear and courage was the answer to every question. The Norse world was not that world. No world ever is, but the legend of it will probably outlast us all. Go back to the shipyard. Not to Lindisfarne, not to the burning monastery, not to the battle. to the place where it actually began, which was a clearing in a Norwegian forest where a man was selecting oak trees by the quality of their grain and the curve of their growth. He was not thinking about England. He was thinking about the hull shape, about whether this plank would take the bend he needed, about the ratio of length to beam that would give him the speed he wanted without sacrificing the stability that the North Sea demanded. He was passing on to his sons what his father had passed to him. Yes, and his sons would pass it to their sons. And somewhere down that chain of transmission, the knowledge would find the moment when everything else was also in place. The social pressure, the hungry men, the warming sea, the intelligence gathered by traders who had already been to the places the ships would go. And the thing that had been building for 1,000 years would finally, visibly, begin.